Coming up on this episode of Nintendo Cartridge Society, we're Z-targeting the ABCs of Nintendo 64, Part 2. It's dangerous to go alone, so the Nintendo Cartridge Society goes with you. Welcome to Nintendo Cartridge Society. My name is Patrick Ellers, and I am joined, as I am always joined, by my co-host, Mark Mitchell. Mark, how's it going?
It's going great. You know, Patrick, a couple of weeks ago at this point, I got a couple of moles removed from the back of my neck.
Yes.
So, but one thing I did not tell you is that I got that when they...
Did you get some added as well?
Well, like matter, you know, moles can
never be
neither
created or
or destroyed. They just get either like transferred to, you know, like some other person.
Sure.
No, they got cauterized.
Oh.
Yeah, they like cauterized the wound, which they
With a lightsaber?
I know that, Patrick. That was not with a lightsaber, but that was exactly my thought. I
Yeah.
was like, oh, in a lot of ways, Luke Skywalker and I are alike.
Yeah, you have a lot in common, for sure. For sure.
And you know,
He lost a hand, you lost some moles.
but both the wounds were cauterized.
Right?
Both of us had our missing limb/mole replaced by mechanical limb/moles.
Yeah, I'm really trying not to comment on the mechanical moles sticking out of the back of your
They're
neck.
loud.
They are loud. I'm doing a lot of work in post-production so you don't hear the cranking and like smoke sounds coming out of them.
But what was really weird was, you know, I was numb
Mm-hmm.
from them doing the procedure. So the doctor was like, you won't feel this, but you'll smell it. And then, and then the torching began.
And then he farted on you. Mark, better than being farted on by your doctor, you can borrow my copy of Sonic Forces for the Nintendo Switch. All you got to do is email us at nintendocartridgesociety@gmail.com. Give us a mailing address so we can send you my copy. This is my copy that I bought with my own money to play by myself, and then decided I would have more fun sending it around the country. You can play it for as long as you want. You send it back. I pay for postage both ways. And there's no trick to it. The one trick to it is that there may be a copy of Untitled Goose Game inside a Sonic Forces box. But there's nothing to be done about that. It's a perfect borrowing program. You should get on the list.
Here's another thing you can do is you can leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere that you get your podcasts. We appreciate it so much. Patrick and I love reading your reviews. It really helps people find the show. It helps boost the signal of the show in the algorithm. If you leave us a 5-star review on the US Apple Podcast Store, we can see it and we'll give you a shout out on the show as a thank you. But if you leave us a review anywhere else or you share the show in some other way, we still want to know. We still want to thank you. It's just harder for us to see it. So let us know. Send us an email, hit us up on Twitter, and we will give you a shout out on the show.
Yeah, or you could let us know that you've done this through our Discord, which Mark and I both are active participants in. How do you get in the Discord, you ask? I'm so glad that you asked here in part 2 of our Nintendo 64 ABCs. You just email us or shoot us a message on Twitter and say, hey, I want to get into that thing. I want to get into that Discord. We send you an invite. You're in. You're talking about Splatoon. You're talking about whatever's going on in the world of Nintendo. Bunch of fun people there having great, cool, chill conversations about Nintendo stuff.
Yeah, there's like a Ring Fit Adventure.
That's right. Adventurers Guild is what we call it. Yes.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah, we're all encouraging each other to get up early in the morning and play Ring Fit Adventure, and having a great time. But you also don't. It's like this. Well, some of those sound like assignments, like you have to spend a lot of time playing Splatoon. You got to spend time getting up early and playing Ring Fit Adventure. No way, man. It's all fun. It's all fun and supportive and great. It's a really good community. I'm so proud and so happy with the community that has formed over there. So get in. You'll have a great time. Mark, we stopped halfway through the ABCs of Nintendo 64 last week, which means now we have to start again and finish the ABCs of the Nintendo 64. Now we stopped right after M, and I think we put like a couple different entries in for M, including Mario 64, which I don't think either of us were like prepared to talk about as a game. But Mark, that's ancient history now, because the new letter that we start on is N, and I would like to begin, as I believe you kicked off the last episode. For me, N, numbers. Man, every title of a Nintendo 64 game has a number in it. Usually that number is 64. But let me just is it all right if I read off just a list of games that have numbers in them?
Yeah, please.
Super Mario 64, Mario Kart 64, Star Fox 64, Wave Race 64, Pilot Wing 64, Excite Bike 64, Donkey Kong 64, Kirby 64, Crystal Shards, Quest 64, Doom 64, Mega Man 64, Harvest Moon 64, StarCraft 64, Ogre Battle 64, and then, of course, 1080 Snowboarding, GoldenEye 007, and double, of course, Clay Fighter 63 and a third.
Oh, man.
People were just crazy about having 64 bits of memory or graphics or whatever to deal with. No one even knows what
yeah,
it means.
I know. It's so what a feat of marketing.
Well, yes, truly, like an astonishing feat of marketing.
I feel like some Nintendo consoles, they hit on this naming scheme that allows them it's like an easy out for naming a game, right?
Right.
You got that with the Super Nintendo.
Yeah.
You got that with the Nintendo 64, and then you got that with the Wii.
Well,
like everything was
way?
like Wii Sports, Wii, fitness, Wii.
Oh, sure, but like you couldn't have like a Castlevania Wii or like a Harvest Moon Wii.
Oh yeah, that's true. When they did Punch Out, it wasn't like Punch Out Wii.
Right, it was just Punch Out.
Wii Punch Out.
Right, yes. But the Game Boy Advance also was another one where like a lot of games just got Advance tacked on the end of them. But yeah, we haven't had one of those in kind of a while. I take it back. I think the 3DS actually has a fair number.
Oh yeah,
whatever.
And DS for sure.
For DS for sure. Okay, so we've gotten a few of these. But it's just so funny that 64 is the thing that people latched onto.
My N is for not, because the Nintendo 64 is the only Nintendo home console where you could not play the original Super Mario Brothers.
Huh. The only just home console?
Right.
The only one where you cannot play the original Super Mario Brothers.
Well, because there are handhelds where
Right.
you can't play the original Super Mario Brothers.
Game Boy.
Game Boy for one. Nintendo DS probably for another. I can't remember. Like,
Oh yeah, that's a good point.
I don't
like, well,
think it got released on DSi.
but you could play the GBA cart on it on the DS.
Yeah, I guess that's true. But yeah, the only home console, because on GameCube you could play it technically in like the Animal Crossing arcade.
Oh yeah.
But I know that this is true for Super Mario Brothers, but it has to also be true for Super Mario Brothers 2 and Super Mario Brothers 3, right? There's no
Well,
but I don't know that for sure.
Can you play Super Mario Brothers 3 and Animal Crossing on GameCube?
Oh, maybe that.
Maybe
that's why.
yeah.
Because I think you cannot play them on the Nintendo 64, but that's maybe what makes
Right.
Super Mario Brothers so unique is that it didn't. Yeah.
Let me. How did you encounter this information? Because this feels very specific.
Well, because I was trying to think when we were going through this, I was trying to think of like, obviously when we're doing these ABCs, like just makes sense to talk about Mario.
Yeah.
And that's what I was thinking about. It's like, oh wait, actually, I don't know. Like, I had to Google it to confirm.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was like, oh,
So this is
there
like a Mark Mitchell original discovery that this is the only system that you cannot play.
Well,
the
I would
original
say
Super
it was
Mario
a
Brothers
discovery
on.
for myself when I Googled, "Can you play
I
Super Mario Brothers on Nintendo
Mark
64?"
discovered this. I think you're a pioneer.
But yeah, just kind of a weird fluke of history is that, you just could not play. Which, can you imagine trying to play Super Mario Brothers with like the Nintendo 64
Yeah,
controller?
it'd be super easy. You would just hold it on the two ends of the trident. This is what I call the Mortal Kombat grip. In Mortal Kombat Trilogy, you would hold it with on the extreme left and on the extreme right, and just use the D-pad.
Just be a very wide.
Yeah, just a very wide stance.
A wide stance.
Yeah.
Yeah, just a strange fluke of history. My O
Mm-hmm.
is for Ocarina of Time, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time.
So my O is just Ocarina, but please let's talk about the Ocarina of Time.
Well, just because, at the end of last episode, even though it wasn't one of our official M's, we talked about Mario 64 and what like a seismic event that was in gaming. I feel like Ocarina of Time is another one of those. For as kind of weird and scrappy as the Nintendo 64's library is overall, these two games are so like momentous in what they achieved. Like, Mario 64 was kind of the first 3D platformer that really, I don't know if it is the first or if it's just like the first that
It's like the first one that feels
that
good.
mattered.
Yeah.
But Ocarina of Time, again, they invented Z targeting for it.
Yeah.
Like, which is something like locking on to an enemy is something that we take for granted in 3D games now, but something that originated in Ocarina of Time. That's not to even mention, how it set the template for Zelda games for another, 15, 20 years?
Yeah, well, and like it effectively invented a genre of another genre of game within the greater umbrella of The Legend of Zelda. Yeah, I mean, Ocarina of Time is a remarkable achievement, both in what it like pioneered and just in like the size of the game. The fact that you play, for however long you play those first 3 dungeons, and like you feel as though you've experienced the world, and then you time travel, and there's like 3 times as much game after that. Like it's a truly remarkable piece of video game entertainment for sure.
That is still fun to play today.
Yeah. So my O is just referring to the ocarina in the Ocarina of Time and in Majora's Mask. And of all the things that Ocarina of Time introduced to the Zelda franchise, in that sort of like 3D style, the concept of a playable instrument that you are playing with the buttons on a controller is so unique and cool, and it has a gameplay mechanic that like a necessary one that you have to engage with a bunch, where you're memorizing these songs, and back in the day when there wasn't just like the menu to pull up the song, like you had to like learn these things, right? That's never been replicated in an effective way, or in like as compelling a way. Yeah, the Wind Waker, you have to like choose which direction you're going in time, and in Twilight Princess you're like howling as the wolf, and you have to like control that. But like there's just no freedom like the 5 buttons of the ocarina, and then the 2 buttons to bend the pitch. You can play actual melodies with the ocarina. Like, it's just so cool. They made an instrument you can play.
It also just felt like, with later Zelda games, because again, this is another thing that existed that they would replicate up through Skyward Sword. It just kind of felt like checking a box almost.
Yeah.
Where they were like, well, we established this in Ocarina of Time, and so every Zelda game needs to have this sort of element. Whereas maybe just because Ocarina did it first, but it feels more like part of that game, versus some of the other ones where you're just like, well, this exists because it exists in Ocarina of Time.
Right. Well, and like it's also cool to see the ocarina mechanics come back identically in Majora's Mask. That they're like, no, that's the part that we nailed 100%. Don't tweak it at all. the ocarina is perfect. All right, Mark. My P is for Pokemon spin-offs, because what a weird little collection of Pokemon spin-offs that came out on the Nintendo 64. Nintendo 64 obviously caught in this wave of Game Boy's sudden popularity because of Pokemon, right? And they dare not make like a mainline Pokemon game. Like I don't know how they knew like from the jump that they were like, no, you can't put like a regular role-playing game where you're like going to towns and catching monsters, and like you can't do that on a home console. That has to be relegated to the Game Boy. And so the games that came out, here they are, all bangers: Pokemon Snap, Pokemon Puzzle League, Pokemon Stadium 1 and 2, and Hey You Pikachu. Okay, I said they're all bangers, but Hey You Pikachu is on there. Crazy to think that most of these are going to be out on the Nintendo 64's Switch Online, with the, of course, sole exception of Hey You Pikachu, because that's a game where you were like speaking to the Pikachu. It could like hear like 20 something phrases. Anyway, yeah, just like a neat little place where they were putting Pokemon spin-off games.
Yeah, I mean, you said that they intuited that, hey, it doesn't make sense to put like a full like Pokemon game on the Nintendo 64. I think also they just couldn't. Like, think of the amount
Oh,
of
yeah,
like
interesting.
characters they would have to render. Like a game like that does not exist on the Nintendo 64. I think it's just technically too challenging. But you're right, they were caught up in this.
Well, but like you could do it if you just like kept to the like Game Boy aesthetics, obviously not black and white, but just like sprites. Like you could do that.
But that doesn't exist on the Nintendo 64.
I know.
Like that, like kind of the closest you get is kind of this 2.5D
Yeah.
stuff like they did with Yoshi and Kirby.
Yeah, or like Mario, Paper Mario.
Right. Yeah. And so but you're right that it got caught up in such like this wave of Pokemon mania that they had to like
they had to put
find
something
ways to make it work.
And I don't have another place in this list to talk about the Game Boy pack that's slapped into the back of the cartridge that allowed you to bring your Pokemon into Pokemon Stadium. Which crazy to me that like they're re-releasing those games without the ability to import Pokemon from like another place. I get why, but it's also like, what's the point of having this game?
It feels like such a big part of it.
Yeah, exactly. Just to like, oh, you can see your Charizard on the field like stomping around. So, yeah, weird, cool games.
My P is for partners in Mario Tennis 64, and two, I would say, notable ones. So first, of course, Mario Tennis 64 is where Waluigi comes from, because they needed a double partners for Wario, and so Waluigi was born. But also, we can thank Mario Tennis 64 for bringing back Princess Daisy, who had pretty much been absent from games since Super Mario Land. But, Luigi needed a partner like Mario had Princess Peach, and thus Princess Daisy was brought back into continuity and has forever been a part of the Mario franchise since.
Yeah, which is nice. It's good to have. I mean, Waluigi is a character I struggle with, but yeah, it's great to have Daisy around in stuff again, because she originally appears in Super Mario Land.
Right,
and Mario is rescuing her. Also, the name of that tennis game, I believe, is just Mario Tennis. Yeah, because I was like, we could add that to my list of
that's right,
games that have 64, but no,
yeah.
it's just called Mario Tennis. Yeah, partners. That's good, Mark.
So I'll go with Q now, and my Q is for Quest 64, a game.
This is also my pick.
Okay, yeah. So you have played this game, is that right?
I owned this game.
Okay.
Mark, let me tell you about the struggle of the JRPG fan who bought the Nintendo 64 to play Final Fantasy VII, which never came to the platform. Anything that even remotely resembled an RPG, I was excited about. And I would say that Quest 64 resembles an RPG. But it has such a simple story, and it is so like, I don't know, it's just not good. Like in any way that it could have succeeded and like filled that niche, like it was too kind of like kiddie and too simplified. Not that it was easy, but it was just like, it didn't feel like Final Fantasy. It didn't feel like Dragon Quest. The designs are ugly. The music is bad. Yeah, I really don't have anything good to say about Quest 64.
Yeah, I feel like Quest 64, I've never played it. The reason I have it on my list is because I think it's notable for how few JRPGs or RPGs in general are on the Nintendo 64, especially in America. I think there's like 5 at most.
Yeah, like
Paper Mario was one of them.
Ogre Battle 64 is another one. But yeah, there just aren't many.
Which is such, again, I think part of it is like the technical limitations of the Nintendo 64, and but what like whiplash for people like yourself who were used to, like, the Nintendo and the Super Nintendo were such RPG havens. You know, it's
Yeah, sort of. The NES, not really, right? Like, there's the original Final Fantasy and I guess 4 Dragon Quest games. Um, but like outside of those, like, are there too many other? I guess there probably are out there, just not games I'm super familiar with.
and I think a lot of them are really bad.
Yeah.
But you know, especially like the Super Nintendo, and so going from that to the Nintendo 64, it was a huge part of like that library.
Yeah,
that,
that just evaporated.
yeah.
And it's like Quest 64 looks like, as you're running around, like it has so much the same perspective and like sort of topography as Mario 64 and Ocarina of Time. So like, and when you're running around in an environment like that, you can't help but like think of those games and just be disappointed by how much worse Quest is than either of those. There was a Quest game that came out on maybe Game Boy Color, maybe Game Boy Advance, I don't remember. But yeah, it's just crazy that they like put out 2 of these things that were like, Quest, it's a series. And now it's just gone forever.
Yep.
Okay, I'll go next. R is going to be the Rumble Pack. A really enormous piece of hardware that slammed into the back of your Nintendo 64 controller when you didn't have a memory card in there, that provided the first sort of physical feedback in the form of vibrations. It came packed in with Star Fox 64 and was touted by Nintendo as like the thing that'll make you feel like you're in the game. I loved the Rumble Pack as a kid. I was excited anytime it got any sort of functionality with other games outside of Star Fox. The Ocarina of Time has a thing where it like vibrates when you're near a secret. It's very, I mean, it is cool. It's another way in which Nintendo was predicting the future of controllers. They did it once with the analog stick, and then they were doing it again with the sort of feedback, which is, since then has been built into every controller.
Yeah, without the Rumble Pack, we would never have HD Rumble and never be able to tell how many ice cubes are in that.
We'd never be able
cup.
to tell how many ice cubes are in that cup. It's true.
But no, I mean, the Rumble Pack was a big deal. Like,
Yeah.
it seems silly now, but it was a really big deal. Like, and it was successful enough because you had to buy it separate. I mean, it came packed with some games, but otherwise you had to buy it separately. And it was successful enough that at least in Japan, like, Nintendo re-released Super Mario 64 to support the Rumble Pack.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's really cool. I wonder if you play does the version that's on Nintendo Switch Online, does it have Rumble support?
I don't know.
I'm going to try to turn on my Switch with the Nintendo 64 controller in my hand right now. It usually needs to be charged, so it might not work.
Well, while you're doing that, that's such a great pick for R. I will do my R, which is Rare, the developer. We have talked about them a bunch on the life of this show, but in part 1 of the ABCs of Nintendo 64, Rare they had been developing, for Nintendo since or publishing games on the Nintendo console since the Nintendo Entertainment System, but really became a part of the
Never
Nintendo
forget
family.
Battletoads. Never
That's
forget
right.
Battletoads.
But really it became a part of the Nintendo family
Never forget Anticipation. Is that them? Was Anticipation them?
during the Super Nintendo era. But I would say the volume of work that they were doing during the Nintendo 64 era, they published 11 games for the Nintendo Nintendo 64. They are Banjo-Kazooie.
Yep.
Banjo-Tooie.
Wait, hold on. Let me see if I can name the rest
Okay,
of them.
yeah.
Banjo-Kazooie, Banjo-Tooie, Donkey Kong 64, Diddy Kong Racing, Jet Force Gemini, Perfect Dark, James Bond, GoldenEye 007. No, I stopped there.
But one from last week, Killer Instinct Gold.
Killer Instinct Gold.
The one that I did not know is Mickey's Speedway USA, like another
kart
racer. That was developed by Rare and published by Nintendo.
Again, how is Rare getting these licenses? How are they working with James Bond and Mickey Mouse?
Yeah.
What's happening?
But so yeah, just like a bumper crop of Rare games on the Nintendo 64, and then you get, Star Fox Adventure on the GameCube,
aka Dinosaur Planet.
But really, that's kind of like the end of it. After they burn brightly for a
Yes.
very brief amount of time on Nintendo consoles, and then move on to Microsoft.
I was right. They did develop Anticipation on the NES, so I just wanted to circle back around to that. And that was very important to me. Mark, do you have an S locked and loaded and ready to talk about?
Yes, mine. You talked about it a little bit with number, but just 64 bits.
What does it mean?
What does it mean? Because
Yeah.
like a bit is what, like the smallest unit of like something with computers. It's like the ones and zeros.
Yeah, so my understanding as it was applied to video game systems leading up to this point was it was part of the graphical presentation that in like a single square on the thing, there was like a grid that was for NES 8x8 and for the Super Nintendo 16x16. So it was like the amount of detail that you could fit on the screen graphically speaking.
Oh.
But come the Nintendo 64, it's not really doing sprites anymore. It's doing like polygons. So the bit count is irrelevant.
But it mattered so much
It
as a
mattered
kid.
so
When I was a
much.
kid, it was like, like that's how you measured the power of the console. So
Right,
you
of
had
course.
like 8-bit, and then, when there were 32-bit systems, it's like it was better than like the Super Nintendo, and
right.
then the Nintendo 64 was the granddaddy of them all. And then after this era, bits completely stopped mattering.
No, yeah, the 64 was the last time it mattered.
But there was so much, like, it really was, I called it before a feat of marketing, and truly it was, because none of us understood,
Right.
or I certainly as a kid did not understand what a bit was, but I knew that more bits equaled better.
So I went back and watched some like old news footage around the release of the Nintendo 64, and the reporter was saying that it had 64 bits of memory or something, right? And that's why people were excited about it, and being like, and with good reason, because it has 64 bits of like it was the kind of thing where like everyone accepted that someone reporting the news, saying that like it's 64 bits and therefore it is better.
It was important enough that Nintendo put it in the name of the console.
Yeah, I mean it's absolutely outrageous. Mark, my S, I feel like we've talked about a fair amount already. But my S is Star Fox 64. You had it at the beginning as R-Wing, but I guess I don't really know what else there is to say about Star Fox 64, other than it is a game that it has that arcadiness to it that I talked about last week, but it also has the sort of like there's like a completionist angle to it too that I don't know that I ever actually like cornered, because there are multiple paths through a lot of those levels, and there's a clear rate that you, or like a number of enemies that you beat, that if you get a high enough score, then you get like a little medal that appears on that level, and some of them it is really really difficult to get that medal, and the medal is persistent, so it's not just for like an individual run. So like you can have sort of long-term goals and reasons to like revisit to try and do all that. And then on top of that, there's the multiplayer component, which like is just another reason to like get into dogfights and like play that game forever.
Yeah. And I don't want to overstate
Let's overstate it.
the story in the game,
Mm-hmm.
but it did have like a narrative, and if you one that is like a very classic, perfect for this sort of genre of like swashbuckling space adventure,
Mhm.
where it's about like fathers and sons, and like
Right.
at the end Fox's father's like ghost like guides him out of an exploding spaceship.
It's pretty
You
cool.
know, it's
Yeah.
pretty good.
It's pretty cool.
Like
Yeah.
it's it captures this. I feel like later Star Fox games, they have not leaned into that sense of like pure adventure
Right.
in the way in that Star Fox 64 did. And is it kind of riffing on like, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade and all that kind of stuff? Like, yeah, that's what Star Fox was built for, is to
Yeah.
like rip off those tropes and put them into a video game.
Well, and also like have them acted out by like little animals that look like marionettes. Like, yeah, what absolutely do that?
Yeah. And so I just feel like
You don't need to write a new story.
Star Fox 64 is very successful in that way.
And I'm actually going to talk about Star Fox. No, you know what? I'm gonna just I'm gonna No. I'm gonna hold this till later.
Okay.
So my T is for Turok, the dinosaur hunter. Turok, man, what a strange character. Long storied history. In the comics, there've been Turok comics since like 1950.
Wait,
something.
really? I had
Yeah.
no idea.
Yeah. He originated in, or he didn't originate in Valiant Comics, but he was eventually like folded into the Valiant Comics universe. And then there was a while where Valiant was owned by Acclaim, and Acclaim is the publisher that put out Turok Dinosaur Hunter. And it's one of the early American developed Nintendo 64 games. I read somewhere that it was the first, but I can't confirm that or verify that. So strike it from the record, Mark. I didn't say it. But Turok is a first-person shooter, sort of. Turok does, in fact, get guns at some point. But he's a Native American warrior who is made to fight dinosaurs. And he does. The game always gave me a terrible headache.
Notorious for the amount of fog.
Yes,
in that
so
game.
much fog.
And something with Nintendo 64 games in general
Yeah.
is most of them didn't have a very far draw distance, and so a lot of the worlds in
Very
Nintendo
foggy.
64 games
Very
were very foggy to try to like obscure the fact that they couldn't draw very far out.
They made 3 of these games on the Nintendo 64. 3 Turok games.
Wow.
Is that surprising that there's like so much Turok content out there?
I feel like Turok has, or at least the first one has, a fairly good reputation.
Yeah. I mean, I remember early on getting the like level skip codes and like infinite ammo cheats and stuff like that, and just like kind of sampling my way through the game because it was too difficult. And it was a first person shooter using Nintendo 64 controls, so like how well could I have been controlling that anyway?
Right.
And like I said, it always gave me a headache. So yeah, I didn't play the game much, but like there's something evocative and weird and cool about it.
It definitely, I mean, in the same way that the Capcom series Dino Crisis,
Yeah.
you're like, the idea of it is appealing, like a
Yes.
in Dino Crisis's case, like a survival horror game that is with dinosaurs instead of zombies chasing you. Same thing with like Dinosaur Hunter. Like the name itself sells the game.
I mean, here is a universal truth that remains true to this day. Not enough dinosaur video games.
Very true.
Just put whatever else you think you're doing. We're full up on zombie games. We don't need more zombie games. Make those zombies dinosaurs, and it's instantly scarier.
It's so true. That is really interesting. I had no idea that Turok is a comic book character.
Yeah,
That's
he's
really cool.
He's been around a real long time, and they're still making them today.
Well, my T is somebody who should be a comic book character, and that is Tingle.
Tingle. Mark, I can always count on you.
First appeared in The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask.
Yes.
Has since gone on to become a important part
Did not know how that sentence was going to go.
of the Legend of Zelda series, at least in fans' hearts.
Yes.
And we've talked about before how Tingle went through, I would say, like a rough patch where he was not appreciated as much as he could be, as he should be, and
Right.
that deprived us of some Tingle games that were made for Nintendo consoles in Japan but never released outside of Japan.
Games where Tingle is seeking romance.
Oh
Can you
my
believe
gosh.
that we were robbed of Tingle romance games?
But we live now in a world where I think Tingle gets the appreciation he deserves.
I don't know if officially he does, though. I feel like we haven't gotten a Tingle game yet.
No, Nintendo's still, I think, too scared.
Yeah.
But we're primed and ready.
We're ready.
For like,
Give us Tingle.
yeah, like
We'll support him this time. It'll be different.
I think it would be. So yeah, Tingle, you always have a place in our hearts.
Tingle, what can you say about him? Like he's a cartographer who's like he's being suspended by a balloon when you first meet him, right?
Right. Yeah. He has real dad issues.
Real dad issues. His dad doesn't appreciate that he's like 37 and still lives at home.
Uh-huh.
Is that how old Tingle is?
I can't remember. But yeah, I love Tingle, and I think like in some of those romance games, he's canonically straight, but in my heart he's always bi-curious.
Yo, I think so. All those games do is just not show us him dating men. That's it. That's
That's
all.
right.
We just don't see it.
That's
all.
right. My moving on to U. My U is for Ultra, which was kind of like
So this is also my
Yeah,
U.
which is
So
kind
we got
of
a little bit of overlap. U's are hard to do usually.
uh-huh.
But yeah, let's talk about it here. This is the code name for the Nintendo 64.
Which I had never really. So originally it was in Japan. It was going to be the Ultra Famicom and the Nintendo Ultra 64. Like
I
outside
remember
of Japan.
I remember hearing Nintendo Ultra 64, and even sort of like this is where I insisted on still calling it that, because like Ultra, like that's so cool.
Well, and I had never thought about it until I saw that it was called the Ultra Famicom, because the
Yeah, that makes
progression
sense.
then would just be the Famicom, the Super Famicom,
Yeah.
and then the Ultra Famicom.
It's so cool.
Which is very cool. Eventually,
what if when they come out with the next version of the Switch, they call it the Ultra Switch?
that would kind of be awesome.
That would be so rad.
Yeah. But eventually, the Ultra code name would get dropped, and it just became the Nintendo 64 worldwide. So that makes it, I guess, like the first Nintendo home console that had the same name in Japan and outside of Japan.
Yeah. Which I mean, it barely has a name, right? Nintendo 64.
Right. Yeah.
So
like you said,
so
this
funny.
obsession with numbers.
The other thing, oh, man, the Nintendo Ultra 64, I'm sure that's what I thought the console was going to be called when I read in Nintendo Power that Final Fantasy VII was going to be released on the thing. So like, I don't know. In my mind, it's still tied up in the promise of what the machine never was.
Mm-hmm.
So I get a little salty about the Ultra 64 naming convention for it there. But I feel like the sort of like dark clouds and lightning that like accompanied the idea of the Nintendo 64 was still very present in the marketing of the Nintendo 64. Like in a way that like the NES and the Super NES and Famicom and Super Famicom were more like fun friendly things. The Nintendo 64 was the first time where it was like it was going to kick your teeth in with how cool it was.
Yeah, definitely.
And Ultra to me is part of that branding. All right, Mark. On to V. Speaking of marketing and what have you, V for me is for VHSs from Nintendo Power. So they sent out like videos that were promotional videos to explain to readers what sorts of things they should be excited about. And there is one VHS in particular, the one for Star Fox 64, that has been like sitting dormant in the back of my memory. I must have watched this video 50 times. It's like a 10-minute long video. It's on YouTube. You should look it up because Mark, it is. If I were to, I can't even explain how strange it is because it's basically a 10-minute long sketch where two dudes one dude is wearing a Sony shirt, the other dude is wearing a Sega shirt, and they kidnap someone who works at Nintendo, who's wearing like a Star Fox flight suit, and they grill him for details about Star Fox. Star Fox being this, cool new game that's coming out that you can't play on PlayStation or whatever Sega was doing at the time. It's wild. It's a long sketch with like super broad performances. They end up kidnapping another guy who works at Nintendo, and like some of the jokes are pretty good. Like I was a little bit shocked watching it today how solid this thing is. But yeah, the Nintendo and by extension Nintendo Power would just like make these videos as like this is the quintessential like, oh yeah, Nintendo is weird and they market their stuff in strange ways. I can't imagine another company doing a 10-minute long video that is 8 minutes of it are like two dudes pretending to deliver a pizza so they can kidnap someone from the Nintendo laboratory.
That's amazing. I didn't know that existed. That's so cool.
It's crazy stuff.
It's also interesting to think, like I don't know if Sony was doing it during the PlayStation era, but later in like the PlayStation 2 era and on the Xbox, if you were subscribed to the official magazine, sometimes you would get demo discs that would have demos of different games on them. But if Sony was doing that in the original PlayStation era, like Nintendo did not have an equivalent that they could easily do because they weren't going to send game, cartridges to everybody.
Yeah, so the best they could do is hire an improv group to to make a short video.
What
about
a weird
the game.
proto, because when we for an episode a while ago we went back and watched some of the early Nintendo Directs.
Yeah,
and this feels even more prototypical.
Yeah.
Truly Neanderthal.
Yes.
Nintendo Direct.
I mean, in some ways, it feels like the kind of thing that Nintendo would have partnered with Funny or Die or something 15 years later to make this internet-only video that gets trashed for being too corporate or whatever. But yeah, just a weird thing that I had. I wonder if my parents still have it. They kept a ton of VHS tapes. I never would have thrown it out. It's probably in my parents' basement now.
I've got to check it out on YouTube.
Yeah, you gotta.
So my V is for the voice recognition unit.
This is my alternate V and why I hesitated for a second.
Yeah, so this is the unit that came with Hey You Pikachu, which we had talked about a little bit earlier. And like so many of these peripherals, it plugged into the back of the Nintendo 64 controller and had a little microphone,
which means the controller could neither save your information or rumble.
That's right. And there were 20 or some odd phrases that you could use to interact and give directions to Pikachu. If you've never seen gameplay footage of Hey You Pikachu,
horrifying.
It is rough.
Yeah.
Pikachu is in rough shape. But you could do things there's a game where Pikachu's wearing a blindfold, basically a piñata game, and you have to direct him to the right balloon or whatever to knock down. And so it's just people, saying right, forward, back at Pikachu, trying to get this character to do. I don't know that it was fun, but it was certainly, it's certainly interesting if nothing else.
And I don't think it worked particularly well.
I can't imagine that it did.
So the VRU was also compatible with a Japanese only train game. But this is another case where this thing worked with two games. Only one of them came to the States, and that's it. That was it.
Another grand Nintendo tradition. It made me think of the Wii Speak that came with Animal Crossing City Folk for the Nintendo Wii.
For me, the VRU and Hey You Pikachu just makes me think of the Dreamcast game Seaman, which is you raise a little fish with a human face, and he responded to voice commands as well. Again, with a thing that plugged into the controller that had a microphone on it. But that game narrated by Leonard Nimoy. This game just has a Pikachu in it. So you choose. What do you like? Do you like Leonard Nimoy or do you like Pikachu?
I had an alternate V, which is just vampire hunting, to talk about Castlevania 64, a game that I have
just called Castlevania.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. No, we know this for sure because it's not on your list.
It's not on my list.
Castlevania.
I wrote it down as Castlevania 64 and was like, "Is that the name of it?" And I looked it up and it's like, "No," and deleted it.
Just Castlevania.
Just Castlevania.
A game I've never played, but that I don't know that it will come to the Nintendo 64 or Switch Online. But
I guess it's no.
But I hope it does because, well, actually, it's really funny. So. On the Castlevania fandom wiki, there's a section for critical response, but it was written by someone who clearly
they have an axe to grind.
Likes this game.
Oh, the opposite.
They like this game because they editorialized, and I'm going to read directly from it because I thought it was really funny. However, some claim that these negative impressions have come from people who only played a little of Castlevania 64. And there's no notation or citation.
Right, citation needed.
However, many players also note that Castlevania improves dramatically in both graphics and level design as players progress. Defenders of the game also respond with the fact that Castlevania 64 was the first game that KCEK had ever programmed in 3D. They also speculate, citation needed, that the programmers were just trying to rush out for a holiday release.
Oh my goodness.
But I would like to play this game. I'm a big Castlevania fan. I like, the Symphony of the Night styled games, and that is really what Castlevania became after Symphony of the Night was released. But I do miss just kind of the more traditional platformers. And, barring the editor of the Castlevania fandom wiki, it does have a reputation of being a rough game.
Yeah, it is.
But I would like to play it.
Well, here's the thing. I mean, I think Konami sees the value of re-releasing their Castlevania games in collections. They've done it a couple times in the last couple years. Man, it's a good thing we don't get paid to do this podcast.
Well, you know what? It's true.
It is true though.
Factually
A
correct.
couple times in the last couple years. So I imagine we'll see it at some point, but I don't think it'll be coming to the NSO. Mark, what's your W?
My W is another peripheral, but one that was never released publicly, but was available for like developers and journalists, and that's the Wide Boy 64.
This was mine as well, but I will choose another W.
Okay, so it was created, like, developed by Intelligent Systems.
Which is wild, by the way.
Yes. The Wide Boy 64, it's an adapter that is similar to the Super Game Boy, and so it'll play Game Boy games, but there was no, like, Super Game Boy equivalent for the Nintendo 64 that released to consumers. Like,
That's
you
right.
could not play Game Boy games on your Nintendo. You could plug a Game Boy game into, like, certain peripherals in order to transfer.
Right, but you couldn't play directly from those, yeah.
So there's two versions of the Wide Boy 64, one for the Game Boy and one for Game Boy Color, and there was also one later for, like, Game Boy Advance game packs. But for the gaming press, they used it to capture, like, nice screenshots of Game Boy games. And then for developers, obviously, it was an easier way to, like, debug and test Game Boy games. But I guess it was also used for final matches at the Pokemon League Summer Training Tour in 1999. But you could purchase one directly for Nintendo for a cost of $1,400 back in the late 90s.
Why not release this?
Yeah, I don't. Why not have a Game Boy?
Because they had the Super Game
type,
Boy and the Game Boy Player just on one generation earlier, one generation after.
But going back to, like, why they did not have, like, a mainline Pokemon game on here, or they had no pixel arty games at all. I just wonder if they did not want to associate the Nintendo 64 with,
That's
like,
a pretty
that
good
sort
point.
of,
Yeah.
Like, the Nintendo 64 was ultra. It was supposed to be the, like, far future generation.
Right. So it could not be associated with the Game Boy.
Yeah.
Like, that's for children. This is for intense men.
Also, the Nintendo 64 maybe was just not successful enough that they kind of, like, what was...
They just backed away from it so they could get the GameCube out. Yeah, that makes sense. So I had originally also put the Wide Boy 64 on here. We can pause for a second on there just to be like, what a name. What a name.
It's so good.
Wide Boy.
Do you think...
We're like long haul truck in here.
10-4 Wide Boy. Do you think that the reason it's called Wide Boy is because it took, like, GameCube games and widened them?
You wait, Game Boy games?
Oh, sorry, Game Boy games.
What? No, that doesn't make any sense because it also, like, tallens them. It's not called a tall boy, because that is a large beer. No, Mark. So my W, I got to go back to Wave Race 64. What an incredible game! What a bizarre franchise to kind of come out of nowhere. And, like, have a little bit of a run on Game Boy Color, on Nintendo 64, and GameCube, where you're just, like, racing around on jet skis. I suppose jet skis were part of the sort of, like, cultural vernacular at the end of the 90s. But, like, I don't know, do people talk about jet skis now? I mean, the last time I remember hearing about one in culture was in Loki, that Owen Wilson's character wanted to ride a jet ski.
Right, which partly was a, like, played for laughs because it's like a jet ski. Like,
Right.
what, like, interesting, specific.
Yeah.
But no, jet skis still exist and they are very fun, but it is not like a cultural phenomenon like it was in the 90s.
Right.
Where, like, jet skis were selling you a lifestyle in the 90s.
Well, and then, like, somehow Wave Race spins that into lifestyle / competitive sport, which is also kind of like a I don't know, like, motorcycle water ballet. Does that make sense? That, like, you're doing handstands on these things and, like, flipping around. It's just the way that this game, like, incorporates the physics of the water and the way that you have to either like duck under obstacles under the water or like bounce off a wave just right to like take a turn is very interesting and very cool. And it is like high tide and low tide in dynamic ways. So like the track is never the same as you're going through. Mark, I know you just recently described the game as looking like half butt,
But the nice half.
the nice half of the butt. But yeah, this is I had this game when it came out originally, and so I was so excited when it came to the Nintendo Switch Online.
Like it for all the reasons that you mentioned. Also, the soundtrack is so good.
Great soundtrack.
I had the soundtrack playing while I was putting my
that's
ABCs
amazing.
together to like really get in the mood of the Nintendo 64. Love the soundtrack to that game.
It almost has like the proto Wii not Wii Music, Wii Sports music to it.
100%. Yeah, and same like sort of thing as like Pilot Wings, like kind of this like
Yeah.
contemporary like light jazz type thing going for it.
Right, the sort of like joyful jazz.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I don't know. It's very smooth, very fun. Mark, my ex, I am now summoning a game that you did refer to as totally looking like but F-Zero X, the sequel to the Super Nintendo F-Zero. Way more tracks, way more racers, way more characters. Same basic game. I've never been able to wrap my head around F-Zero X. I know you played it for just like a little bit on the Nintendo Switch Online. But yeah, I don't. Do you have any other like impressions of F-Zero X?
F-Zero is just like it's such a like it's so difficult.
It's too hard.
Yeah. So that's why I had a hard time getting into it because it's like it's really difficult
Mm-hmm.
and it doesn't look amazing
Yeah,
in my opinion.
yeah. No, I will agree.
I was just trying to figure out if it is the last Nintendo developed F-Zero game.
Oh, before Sega started doing
Yeah,
them?
but it's not.
Oh,
So,
okay, right.
my X is
Stop looking.
Exactly. My X is for crossover, and
Ooh.
specifically, I want to talk about Super Smash Brothers,
Okay.
a franchise that we now take for granted as existing, but is kind of crazy that it happened.
Yes.
Because you're taking Nintendo characters from all these different franchises that should not interact with each other. But, Sakurai came up with this kind of framing device of them being toys that are being played with, which is what allows. And I feel like they have dropped that.
Oh, yeah, totally.
From like after the Nintendo 64 game. But that was like an important part of it was like, how do we.
I feel like that was sort of present in the Wii version, right? Because, or at least that they kept like being turned back into. Like the little statues that were toys. I don't know. I just that physicality is still there, and then like Amiibo sort of play that game
yeah.
too. So notes of it are still there, but you're right that like the hardcore conceit of it is gone.
Well, and I liked that. I like like looking back on it that was an important thing for Nintendo was like, okay, how do we like we're fine with this happening, but how does it make
Tell
sense?
me how. Tell me
right?
how,
Like
yeah.
why is it okay for
Tell me how.
all these different characters from different franchises to be interacting and fighting each other? And yeah, it's such a cool thing that has been such a big part of Nintendo. It truly blew up with Melee on the GameCube, but I remember having a ton of fun with the original Super Smash Brothers.
Yeah, well, and there's I'm not going to get the details of it right, but before it had Mario characters in there, it was just sort of like there were or Nintendo characters in general. They were working on this game with sort of like generic looking like dudes, and I'm sure that would have been fine, but like it's being able to staple all of these different IP onto it turns it into something like very special and cool and something that I want to play.
Yeah, it felt like a little transgressive in a fun way.
Yeah, totally.
Pikachu was my main. Pikachu, I feel, is probably overpowered in the original Super Smash Brothers, and in following games, was definitely nerfed. But yeah, I loved Pikachu. Could wreck people with Pikachu.
Yeah, the original version of Smash Brothers with just like non Nintendo characters was pitched by Masahiro Sakurai as Dragon King the fighting game. So there you go. All right, where are we?
But we're on Y, and my Y is Yoshi's Story.
Mark, you'll be not surprised to discover that we have again picked the exact same game for our Y.
And way back in the first year of the show, episode 67, we had friend of the show Kelly Nugent on to talk about Yoshi's Story. But one of the reasons that I wanted to bring up Yoshi's Story, because it's not a game that I played as a kid or that like is especially meaningful to me. But what I do think is interesting about it is that 2D platformers do not really exist on the Nintendo 64.
Right.
And so even taking, like a game like Yoshi's Island and the sequel to it, Yoshi's Story, like very different types of games. Yoshi's Island still has, even though it is not like technically a Mario platformer, I guess the reverse, it is technically a Mario platformer, but doesn't necessarily play like one. But it has
in a lot of ways it does though, right? Like it still taps into the like platforming challenge aspect of Mario.
Exactly. But like Yoshi's Story kind of like gets rid of that.
Wait,
It's
just
all about
to the curb.
like collecting fruit, and that's how you advance from levels. It's just like collecting enough fruit to fill the border of the screen.
Right. And you want to collect the right fruits. I never really wrapped my head around the mechanics of that game or how to succeed at it.
And so it's a lot slower, it's a lot more methodical, it's much more like puzzle based. And I felt the same way when a couple of months ago I tried to play, or I did play, Kirby 64 or just no 64.
Kirby 64.
Oh, it is a
colon,
64. Yeah, the Crystal Shards.
There you go.
Because Kirby in general is more like approachable and is already slower, it works okay in a Kirby game. I didn't love the Crystal Shards, but those are really like the only two examples I can think of like 2D platformers
Yeah.
on the Nintendo 64, which is, I understand why they did it. 3D graphics were such an important selling point.
Right. This isn't a baby game.
Exactly.
Right.
But I do think we're really missing that from
from the library.
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah, it's also just like it's crazy to me that as a sequel to Yoshi's Island that like it loses all of the sort of edge of Yoshi's Island, right? Like or of I said what I meant. That like the challenge of just like getting from one space to the next just like isn't there. And yeah, I don't know. It's just such a bizarre game. And I'm happy that it's there, but it seems like in sequels, in the Yoshi series, they sort of like started to steer it back the other way. And like the Yoshi franchise is always kind of in a weird place, where like there's some like platonic ideal that like no one can agree on what it is that makes a Yoshi game good. But yeah, this is one of those chapters in the greater Yoshi story. And I didn't mean to make that pun there. Mark, what's your Z?
My Z is for Zebus. And the reason it's for Zebus,
no Metroid,
is because Metroid is notably absent from the Nintendo 64, and I had never really spent the time to consider like why that is the case. And so when I was putting together this ABCs, I went looking, why did Metroid not get a Nintendo 64 entry?
And why can't it crawl?
Right. And so in looking for it, there was an interview with series like producer and creator Yoshio Sakamoto in Games magazine. And so I'm just going to quote directly from the interview. Games asked, "This apprehension over 3D gaming, is that the reason there was never a Metroid 64? And Sakamoto responds, "I was actually thinking about the possibility of making a Metroid game for Nintendo 64, but I felt that I shouldn't be the one making the game. When I held the Nintendo 64 controller in my hands, I just couldn't imagine how it could be used to move Samus around. So for me, it was just too early to personally make a 3D Metroid at that time. Also, I know this isn't a direct answer to your question, but Nintendo at that time approached another company and asked them if they would make an N64 version of Metroid, and their response was that no, they could not. They turned it down, saying that unfortunately they didn't have the confidence to create a Nintendo 64 Metroid game that could compare favorably with Super Metroid. That's something I take as a compliment to what we achieved with Super Metroid."
Huh. Yeah, I mean the thing that's so incredible about that is no one is like, "Oh yeah, just make another 2D Metroid game just with better graphics."
Right. Yeah. It kind of going back to that Yoshi story thing where it was like 2D gaming was just
Was
not on the
over. Yeah,
radar.
all these games have to be different.
Yeah.
And it's amazing how frequently they did it and did it well, right? That like, no, okay, Mario's here, but Mario's different. Mario has fundamentally changed. Zelda is different. It will never be the same again. Um, yeah, just that they couldn't just like make another 2D Zelda, even though like they probably coulda, and like you know, maybe it wouldn't have been exciting at the time. And I guess that's what it boils down to, is that they had to be, it had to be new at the time.
Yeah. I also I don't know enough about like the capabilities of the Nintendo 64. Like, could it render pixel graphics if they wanted to, or did they were they hemmed in by the like
Yeah, that's a
by
good
the
point.
architecture that
Yeah.
it needed to be polygons? But I also think it's interesting that Sakamoto here is saying I couldn't wrap my head around how to make a 3D Metroid game, and I don't
And
think
never
he ever
did.
has.
Yeah.
Like the Rare game or the
Retro.
Prime games were
Yeah.
made by Retro Studios, and Sakamoto was not like a producer on those games. The next Metroid game with Sakamoto's involvement, I believe, was Other M, which was back to more of a traditional 2D style, and then the remake of Samus Returns and Return
Dread.
of Samus,
Yeah.
and then Dread, which have all been in like the traditional 2D style.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just weird to think like how far like games has come as like a business where and especially like that Nintendo has embraced the idea of like, oh no, we can make another, oh yeah, we can do Link Between Worlds, that's just another 2D Zelda, we can just make that, or like Metroid Dread, yeah, we can just make another 2D Metroid. It doesn't have to, we don't have to be embracing the newest thing in gameplay. And maybe that's because we've gotten to a point where like there is no like the new thing right now. Like there are many new things and many old things sort of existing all at once, and they're all exciting,
Yeah,
or they all have the potential to be exciting.
it's like there was like this like split, where like different paths of gaming,
Yes.
and then everything's kind of like converged back into one. Also, as I was saying, listing the games that Sakamoto worked on with Metroid, I don't want to leave out Zero Mission or
Fusion. Right.
which did release during the GameCube era, but were 2D Metroid games.
Right. Well, and yeah, so I mean, maybe that's part of it, is that they just had a home for those kind of things on the handheld, and now we live in a world where the handheld is the home console. So yeah, you got to put all those games out there. Man, I hope Nintendo does get back to a place where they are putting out more of that like lower investment, not super cutting edge stuff that would have been on DS or Game Boy Advance.
It does feel like a missed opportunity of the Switch era that
Yeah.
those two aren't living more like side by side.
Yeah, they definitely should. Mark, for my Z, I had Zelda here. Although again, I think we've talked a lot about both of the Zelda games that appeared on this platform, but like just trying to wrap your head around the legacy of the Nintendo 64 without those two Zelda games, the whole thing feels hollow, right? Like they are the single player. We talked already that there were not RPGs on this thing. Zelda always sort of skirts that line between like, is it an RPG? Is it an action game? Is it somehow an adventure game? And like it had to totally fill the role of RPG on the system because no one else was doing it. And it did it in a way that's like, world class. There aren't games that there weren't games that told a story like either of them. So yeah, I mean, it's Zelda is obviously an important game, an important franchise on every console, on every Nintendo console. But I'd say outside of the Switch's relationship to Breath of the Wild, no other Nintendo hardware has had as close or as important of a relationship with Zelda as the Nintendo 64.
I think that's so true. And I also think that the unique circumstances of the Nintendo 64 are what made this weird experiment called Majora's Mask possible.
Yes.
And that on any other hardware, like I don't think it would have happened, but it was like, okay, Ocarina of Time was a big success. You have like 18 months to turn this thing around,
Right.
you know? And like just go off and you kind of have like free reign to do whatever weird thing you want to do.
Mark, we're to the end of the alphabet now, and we've not really talked about Paper Mario. How did that happen?
Oh, yeah. It's true. I mean, I love Paper Mario, and we're talking about RPGs.
We are talking about RPGs.
You know, Paper Mario was one of the few RPGs on the system. The first game I played it almost a year ago exactly, for when it was released on Nintendo Switch Online. Was super excited for Paper Mario because it's been a long time. It had been a long time since I played that first game. It's great.
Yeah, holds up. Like it is still fun, and I'm still delighted by the like tiny economy of that game, where like you deal 1 damage, or you deal he's charging up, he's dealing 3 damage now, and I don't know, the control that you have over increasing your flower points, your attack power, or your hit points, is it attack power, or is that?
I think it's
There's hit points, flower points, and a third thing.
It's like badges. How many badges?
Yeah, badges.
You can,
That's right. That's right.
BP.
So it's everything is so the smallest integer is so meaningful in that game, and I love that sort of thing. All right, Mark, we have now completed the Nintendo 64 ABCs. Let's close this out. All right, and that's going to do it for this episode of Nintendo Cartridge Society. Remember, please rate, review, and follow us on Apple Podcasts or on whatever app you're listening to this on. We appreciate it tremendously. When you do, you can also share the show on Facebook or Twitter or any old place where sharing is allowed. If sharing isn't allowed, don't do it. Okay, like follow the rules. We appreciate that too. You can follow us on Twitter. I'm at Patrick_Ellers. Mark is at MKE Mitchell, and the show is at NinCart Society. We also have a Facebook page, which is just Nintendo Cartridge Society. Anthony DeLuca made our logo, and our theme music is provided by 8BitBetty. You can get more of his music by going to 8BitBetty.com or by listening right now. For my co-host, Mark Mitchell, this is Patrick Ellers, saying thank you for listening.